So, Martin has already given an introduction for me, so I don't really need to say very much here. So yes, I work for Science and Technology Facilities Council, which is one of the research councils in the UK, which, amongst other things, operates large-scale facilities. So this is a picture of our campus at the Rutherford laboratory, where we have three major analytic facilities: the ICIS neutron and muon source, the diamond synchrotron light source, and a central laser facility. And I'm based in the scientific computing department, which is based in the data center. And what we do is we support the work of those facilities, amongst other things. So I actually have quite an extensive background over the last 10 or 15 years working with those large-scale facilities on doing data management. And from that, I've also been involved in a lot of European open science cloud activities, and as mentioned, involved in the National Physical Science Data Service and the DOME project. But I'm going to focus mostly on what we've been doing on the European Open Science Cloud. Now, I'm sure the European Open Science Cloud is familiar to many people as a major European activity to try and coordinate the development of research infrastructure across Europe. With bringing large-scale infrastructure together. It started about 5 years ago with these sort of reports that came out then, setting the scene for it. We were involved in a major project called EOSC Pilot, which we led, kind of setting some of the feasibility and groundwork studies for it. And that's since evolved into a governance structure with an executive board that operated the last couple of years, and spawned a whole sequence of projects, both cluster projects working in particular domains, right across the research landscape, and also a number of projects supplying infrastructure, providing that foundational and connecting infrastructure underneath the European Open Science Cloud. Started, big way in Horizon 2020, continuing equally in an equally large way in the Horizon Europe just starting. And an aspect of the European Open Science Cloud is that FAIR is at the heart. The whole notion of FAIR data, we've mentioned quite a lot today and yesterday already, is that data should be fair. People, I hope, also would know what FAIR means. But just as one slide on that. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and came from this paper that came out in 2016, setting setting a number of guidelines and recommendations for how to achieve these data which has these characteristics. And it seems a sort of recipe for open science, a way of a tractable way of breaking down the problem of how to do open science data sharing and reuse in a way that also helps us control the access to who needs to access it. So FAIR is not exactly equal to open, but it's about being open about data and providing enough information to make it really usable. Now, these are very much guidelines, and interpretation of those guidelines is still very much a work in progress, particularly how it comes from particular domains, and we'll come back to that later. But FAIR has become a sort of cornerstone of science policy or research policy across the world. So here on the right are a couple of quotes firstly from the French National Plan for Open Science, which emphasizes that research should be structured to comply with the FAIR data principles. And from the charity sector, from the Welcome Open Research, their funding guidelines say they also endorse the FAIR data principles. So it's now become universal. And if we go back to the European Open Science Cloud, the rules of participation for the European Open Science Cloud are now specifying that EOSC resources should align with the FAIR principles. That's just published that. And to support that principle, the EOSC and EOSC governance has had a number of activities to kind of coordinate and enhance and recommend what should be done for FAIR. Firstly, this report, Turning FAIR into Reality, that came out a couple of years ago, kind of set a roadmap towards fairness, and then the activities such as the FAIR working group of the FAIR of the executive board, and a significant project called FAIR's Fair that both myself and Yann, who's speaking later, have been involved with, called FAIR's Fair, have been doing a lot of work on surveying the landscape and making very general recommendations on how we should achieve fairness in the EOSC. So a particular example of that, which I've been involved with, is on recommendations around persistent identifiers. So a report came out in the autumn with these guidelines for a policy around persistent identifiers, setting out how what persistent identifiers should perform and how you should try and provision them, particularly if you want to be a sustainable and trustable infrastructure for supporting persistent identifiers into the future. What kind of characteristics should the persistent identifiers have, and more particularly, what kind of characteristics should the organisations providing them have as well, and how they should be used? And it's all in the support of fair data. So and there are a number of other of these recommendations and guidances around for generating fair data in us now, and it gives a good foundation for what we need to do for fairness in the future. However, when it comes to fair in practice, whilst these policies and recommendations give this framework for us, how they actually translate and work down into particular disciplines still, and how should institutes, universities, research laboratories should support the fair science is all very much open to argument and discussion. So what I'm spending the rest of this talk is presenting some work we've been doing in the photon and neutron large-scale facilities community on looking at how that community can support the generation of fair data to support science. And this, the photon and neutron community represent an important community working across sectors in the physical sciences, chemistry, materials, but also in life sciences, engineering, and earth sciences. So as a sector, we can actually form a kind of a centre of good practice, if you like, for generating fair data across these things, and then interact with those particular domain needs for those particular communities too. So in this area, we have two projects. There is no cluster project in materials, but there is one on in the photon and neutron community called PANOSC, and there's also a parallel sister project called EXPANS, which is focusing around the national institutions, the national synchrotron and neutron sources. PANOSC focuses around the large S3 international facilities. These are two sister projects. They're working very, very closely together. They have quite very similar programs. In particular, both projects have a work package 2, which focus on fair data. So I lead the work package 2 in EXPANS, called Enabling Fair Data. And this is looking at making recommendations on the policies, practices, standards, and tools, which will develop best practices for fair data for those facilities, those research infrastructures, and raise awareness to the scientific communities. So what we're trying to do is provide guidance to how the services provided by facilities should support fairness. So we're doing this, sort of breaking this down into a number of steps, which should be on the next slide. There we go. Oops, sorry, I think sorry, I'm having a few connection problems. There we go. So that's for fair facilities. So firstly, we want to look at the policies that around data and management which the facilities have, making a commitment to fair. what support the facility can give for that, where the ownership lies, where the responsibility lies, and what expectations we have on users. So setting out that kind of framework. And then from that, we produce guidelines on how fair data can be supported through the data lifecycle, how we use things like persistent identifiers, metadata, what implementation strategies, and then how would we measure it. And then that reflected into our tooling, what tools we use to produce FAIR, particularly around data storage, data cataloging and publishing, data analysis, and integration with things like virtual research environments and notebooks. And finally, how we then support a FAIR experiment. How does this reflect down to the practice of a particular experiment on an individual instrument? And this is kind of closely related to how we do data management planning and how facility staff and users actually work around the processes we do. So very briefly to look at policy. So we've been revising recommendations for common data policies across all the institutes, and particularly inserting recommendations around access to data, recommendations around what happens when you delete data, what happens with licensing, how you use persistent identifiers. Part of the discussion that we have to look at in this is what you're actually talking about. Are you talking about raw data coming off the instrument, or are you looking at also including data that's coming further down the line as it gets reduced, as it gets analysed, as it gets published? And what is the coverage there? And so we've published this just recently. Moving on from data policy, we then want to look at our guidelines for fairness. And well, what we want to do is make sure we are fair at every step. As an experiment goes through a facility, it goes through a number of stages, from writing a proposal, scheduling the experiment, doing the experimenting, storing the data locally, then using software to analyze it, and eventually leading to some publication. And at every step, we want to maintain fairness. So all along the way, we need to be able to maintain a number of properties, and record a number of properties and record a number of metadata fields on what is actually happening on each stage, and those are reflected down to particular information systems. So by collecting that information as we go through that cycle, connecting all those data and all those metadata and data components together, and then keeping that for the future, we can then maintain fairness into the future. Looking at that in a little bit more detail, as I'm pretty sure I'm beginning to run out of time here. We need to be able to do findability. So we want to have we want to use catalogs of experimental data which store all that information. There are a couple of existing catalogs that are widely used, including ICAT, which I've been heavily involved in, and another system called SciCat, which are general purpose experimental data cataloging systems, and they're based around a common metadata model, which is here, a common metadata model to represent the data and the experiment. So that's what would be the foundation of our support for findability. And we want to be able to federate those together into the EOSC with common information models, common APIs. I will skip accessibility. We have common authentication authorization, but particularly we also need common persistent identifiers. So resource identification using persistent identifiers is a sort of major area we're doing development in, and is not just public identifiers for publications and data, but also for other components that we want to use in the recording, the life cycle, people, organizations, projects. Instruments is of particular interest to us, and also the samples we do and the software. So if we can identify all these particular resources, we can provide a much richer context for the experiment. And there are many initiatives which are going on, supporting identifiers in all these different areas. So what we're looking to do is making recommendations for what is the best ones to pick on all these areas. And we also, as I said, we are looking at particularly at this persistent identification of instruments as a potential area where we can sort of add a new service to building on some new technology there for identifying the instruments that we use. Then there's all the interoperability aspects. Well, we want to provide richer information at many different levels, and this very useful diagram from my colleague Alejandro Gonzalez-Beltran kind of breaks this down quite nicely. We need to have standards for data exchange, the common web services and application interfaces we use, and on top of that, the data language, our data formats we use. Then we have data schemas on top of that, and then common semantics on top of that, with common vocabularies and mappings. And we're making recommendations on all these different areas. So particularly we're focusing on the Nexus format, which is a common data format for the photon-neutron community. It's been around some years, around based on HTF5, and you can produce particular profiles of that for the data coming off particular instruments with the sensors and the samples for each particular, the sensors involved in a particular instrument and the samples which you're recording, and this gives a very good basis for generating the right metadata information about the data for that instrument. And we're now doing some work on abstracting that into an ontology, which is kind of one connection here with what we've been talking about with this meeting. We need a hierarchy of these models and ontologies to represent this information. We have standard models for sort of data holdings, things like DCAT. We've seen models for things like materials with the domain ontology. We've seen this today. We are working to sort of fill the gap in between, model on the environmental life cycle, sort of based around our data catalogs, an ontology of techniques and instruments used in photon-neutron science. This is a screenshot of our prototype in there of some techniques for instruments, and then taking the parameters for those instruments from the Nexus format into a further one. So we have a sort of hierarchy of models ontologies that we're working on to fill that gap, connecting from the data holdings to the domain ontologies. I won't say much about reusability. We're looking at aspects of data licensing.
That's good, because time is almost over.
Okay, so this is my final slide, or nearly final slide. My final point is we want to then have that reflected down to the user, and we reflect down to the user by doing data management planning. So how the user actually, in their particular experiment, organizes their data, organizes their computational resources, and provides metadata. And that's something that's quite new for facilities, so we're now working on that. So this really is my final slide. A summary. So the EOSC has endorsed FAIR for driving data sharing reuse with guidelines. We do need to look at how those reflect on particular domains, and I think the photon-neutron facilities provide a good example of how we're driving towards fair data across domains with a systematic approach for policies, tools, and guidelines. I think I will finish there. So thank you very much for listening.
So if you see the slides, that's perfect. So in the next few minutes, I will present first results from an ongoing research project, as Martin Horst just mentioned, on establishing a management infrastructure for biocatalytic data. And I will try to convince you that the challenges that we face in biocatalysis are similar to many other research fields. So therefore, I would expect that our solutions are transferable, and I'm also looking forward to your feedback on that. Now, the application of enzymes as catalysts in chemical synthesis has many economic and environmental advantages. Enzymes are highly selective, and they function under mild conditions, such as room temperature and using water as solvent. As a result, energy consumption and waste production are reduced. And in addition, enzymes are produced from renewable resources, and because enzymes are proteins, they are biodegradable. And the production costs are predictable, in contrast to large fluctuations in the market prices of rare metals, such as rhodium, which are used as catalysts. However, despite our ability to do this research, and despite many breakthroughs, there are still few industrial processes which are based on biocatalysis. And the reason is that our ability to develop biocatalytic processes is still too slow. The bottleneck can be overcome by improving bioprocess development, by integrating modeling and novel data analysis methods, such as machine learning, with more automated experimentation. Now, there are three major, so this has also, the challenges for digitalization has also been recognized in a recent white paper issued by colleagues from catalytic sciences, both from academia and from industry, where the data management plays a central role in this digitalization effort. That there are three major challenges for data management. So in data acquisition, we have to deal with an increasing level of automation of experimentation, which requires also an automation of documentation and of data recording. This data must become accessible to different specialists in modeling, who apply then different mechanistic models, but also recent data-driven modeling approaches, such as machine learning. And the results have to be published and communicated in a format which makes experiments reproducible. Therefore, data and metadata have to be complete and machine readable. So the role of data management in enzymology and biocatalysis is that we have to deal with standards or improving standards for laboratory automation, which will provide us with interoperability of devices and free and open standards. We will also see that experimental data will be automated, experimentation will be automated, so a tool to document and for data acquisition should be scalable. Then we will see, or we will need a comprehensive documentation of metadata, of the methods to make experiments reproducible. We also need then to transport data to modeling and data analysis tools to make them, to analyze data and to also design new experiments. We then have to integrate experimental and modeling data for analysis, for data analysis and modeling. And finally, we have to publish data as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. However, experimental data today is still recorded mostly in spreadsheets. So only a very small fraction of experimental data is recorded, analyzed, and published. Data storage is done by local files usually, so data storage is temporary and usually really inaccessible, especially if a PhD student has left the group and 5 years later you try to find original data. This is almost impossible. So data is certainly not findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. As a result, publication of data is difficult to read, or data from publications is difficult to obtain. So publication process is inefficient because data is published in plain text, in tables and figures, and also frequently incomplete. And this is a recent paper by Peter Horling and co-authors, where they just investigated 100 papers in the field of biocatalysis and biochemistry. And in almost 50% of all papers, very essential information, the enzyme concentration, was not given. So this experiment cannot be reproduced without this important information. So in every paper, there was something missing which would have been necessary for reproducibility. As a result, scientific results are hardly replicable, and this is why we are talking about a reproducibility crisis, not only in catalytic sciences, but throughout science. And what we need for solving these problems are community standards and a data exchange format for exchanging data to make it machine readable. Now, there are community standards in the field of biocatalysis and enzymology. These are the Strender guidelines, standards for reporting enzymology data. And these guidelines give a detailed list on what information should be given in a report of an experiment. One should describe what is the enzyme, what is the catalyst, what was its source, how was it modified. We should also learn and report on the reaction itself and the assay. So what was the pH, what was the temperature, what was the substrate concentration, how much enzyme was used. You might imagine, all these details, which are frequently missing, at least part of it. And of course, the results. So what was the enzyme activity obtained? I mean, what are the units of the values reported, which is also sometimes a matter of, or a source of problems, and so forth. I don't want to go into details of that. So a very detailed, comprehensive description of the experiment and the results. This is given as guidelines. And what we now started to work on 2 years ago, we started with the project, was to develop a data exchange format based on XML, the extensible markup language, which is a file format for the communication of data and of metadata. So examples are hypertext markup language or the systems biology markup language. And our exchange format, the enzyme ML, is based on SBML. So it's a markup language for describing biocatalytic enzymatic data. So it's a language, it's not a database, it's not a program, of course. So there is now, since 2 years, an international development team, including Frank Bergmann, Carsten Kettner, Santiago Schnell, Niels Wainston, Ulrike Wittig, and 4 students in my group. Colin Halupchuk started, and Jens Lohmann started with the project, and Simone Lauterbach and Yann Rangenau continue with it. So EnzymeML is a communication channel, if you wish, a communication standard where we link experimental platforms, modeling platforms, and publication platforms by a unique, great, happy about that. Okay, good. So the experimental platforms we use for getting access to or to record reaction conditions, but also time course data, which means what did we measure as a substrate concentration as a function of time, for example. So we get the complete description of the experiment and the experimental data. And this is then stored in an EnzymeML formatted document, which might be a file, for example. And examples for these experimental platforms is a spreadsheet that we have developed that we can then, nobody likes to edit XML files, so that you can fill in this data into a spreadsheet and then convert it to EnzymeML. Or we collaborate with Dörte Rother and the PhD student in her group, Stefan Malzacher, develop an electronic laboratory notebook to collect this data. So there are different input platforms, so to say, to generate experimental data in EnzymeML format. As a next step, we then transfer this EnzymeML document to modeling platforms such as Copasi or our own BioCatNet data modeling system, modeling platform, but also others, where the experimental data, the original experimental data, but also the modeling results. And then this package is moved on to publication platforms such as StranderDB or SAPURK, publicly available databases for biochemical reaction kinetics, for example. and then it's uploaded there and available and searchable and, and can be downloaded again. So this is the technical view to the whole system. There are in the first layer, there are the tools, data acquisition tools, data modeling tools, data publication tools that I mentioned already. And then the connection to the ENSIML document is done via a RESTful API that we are currently implementing. It's not yet online, but it's already working. And so the communication to this RESTful API will happen by HTTP protocol, standard communication protocol. So this API then allows you, or allows the application, to read, write, edit, and visualize either an ENSIML document as a file that you can then download, or, and this is also what we're now exploring, as a dataverse entry. So the idea would be to not only store data locally as a file, but also as a dataverse entry, which then can also be retrieved and which also can then be published if you wish. So as I mentioned, the content of this file is reaction conditions, data information on the enzyme, the name, its sequence, its accession number, its concentration, very importantly, but also, about the reaction, what are the initial concentrations of substrate, products, pH, temperature, additives. Then the original time course data, concentration of substrates or products at different time points, but we can also deal with several initial concentrations or multiple replica, so we can then really, collect many experiments to compare and to analyze. But also the modeling is reported. So the kinetic law, either macrokinetic or microkinetic model, and kinetic parameters that have been estimated from this analysis. We have quite a few ongoing projects now, both with providers or developers of electronic lab books. I mentioned already our spreadsheet and the BioCutUp tool, but we also are in collaboration with Nicole Jürgen from KT on also getting Chemotion, that tool Chemotion, to create ENSIML documents. We are also collaborating with the group of Merce Grosas from Harvard University on Dataverse, but also with local colleagues from working on Dataverse, especially with Dorothea Iglitsakis. And we collaborate with quite a few modeling platform or software providers now. I mentioned Copasi and BioCutNet already, but also with Interferency, with Pleiss, but also with companies like Inpixion, who now develops and distributes SigmaPlot, or with IceCap and with Best Curve Fit. So we have not yet implemented the format upload and download, but we are working on that currently. And of course, we collaborate with public databases. I mentioned already StranderDB and SubURK, but also with Enzyme Portal, UniProt from ABI. And of course, we not only develop the infrastructure, but in parallel, we test already the infrastructure for its usefulness, for analyzing and reanalyzing experimental data. So there's now a handful of collaborators where we test with their original data, which then also drives, of course, the development of the infrastructure. So finally, I would like to acknowledge the team, which I mentioned already. I acknowledge our collaborators. I certainly have to acknowledge, and happily acknowledging, funding agencies that support our efforts. And I would be glad if you get convinced that this is something interesting, that you might collaborate and participate in this project, either as an experimentalist or as a modeler or as a software developer, or maybe as a group who wants to transfer this system to another application. And we are now really already exploring, possibilities to transfer the system to other research fields. So thank you for your attention, and I'm glad to take questions and discuss with you on this project.
So again, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to present the platform Material Digital, which has been funded by the German Federal Ministry of Research and Technology, abbreviated BMBF, since July 2019. And this is a joint project, and the following institutes are involved: Fraunhofer IWM in Freiburg, the Karlsruhe Institute for Technology, the Max Planck Institute for Iron Research in Düsseldorf, the Leibniz Institute for Material-Oriented Technology, and as you mentioned, BAM in Berlin. So the German government regards digitalization of materials as being of strategic importance for Germany as a business location, which can only be adequately addressed by pooling the effort of all stakeholders, from academia as well as from industry. And that, of course, represents a huge challenge. The aim of our project is to develop a sustainable platform that brings together and supports interested parties from industry and academia in the sustainable implementation of digitalization tasks for materials. At the same time, tools are being developed with which the digitalization of materials can also be put into practice. There are, of course, already many scattered activities, and we aim to bundle the effort of all stakeholders, at least in Germany. With that, we expect to eliminate redundancies and a lack of acceptance and advance a common basis in the digitalization of materials. And the innovation platform Material Digital was launched to initiate the appropriate measures. And the platform, which I will present today, serves primarily to structure the topic area, but also serves as an interaction and communication platform. I would like to briefly address the requirements that arise in this context. Efficient and short innovation cycle affords the digital exchange of material data, either within a life cycle of a given product or even over many life cycles. And material data, as you know, are characterized as being of heterogeneous character. They are not continuously available. The data exchange rate is in many cases very low, and the data management is often insufficient and not compatible with complex tools for data analysis. The digitalization of material science and engineering will shorten the development time of new materials, allow a more flexible production, and make component use more reliable. The strategic value of the digital consistent material representation are the basis of the economic cycle. So the standardization processes need an overcritical number of stakeholders, and they must on a long-term basis. And we need compatibility across a large number of domains. Stakeholders often follow apparently very different objectives, and at the moment it was not possible to establish a common strategy. Therefore, the BMBF has set up the program Material Digital, and the basis is a platform which is funded in the first funding period. And within this platform, we work on different tasks. For example, a structural task on standardization, compatible ontologies, and digital workflows, also on a roadmap. And then, of course, on infrastructure questions like providing algorithm concepts, material data, and software packages. And also networking is, of course, very important. So we are in contact with our stakeholders. We organize workshops. We work with or are in touch with technical committees, and also use education and training to bring the topic forward. Our stakeholders are in academia, as well as and especially in industry. And to make sure the interests of industry are followed, we also have an industrial board which accompanies our work. So in the second phase of the project, academic projects are funded, and the first of them just started. And in the third funding period, there will be joint projects between academic partners and industry partners. So the platform infrastructure is implemented through a network of decentralized servers in blue that are locally operated, and a central server hosted by the platform. And we have then local clients, here shown in green, that allow users to access the data and resources. The central server will be the control center that forwards user requests to all decentralized local servers, giving user access to the shared data. And the data are not necessarily public data. So in industry, we expect that they are private, and but anyway, so the clients should be able to get in touch with also these private servers. And then a central task of the platform is to make the software tools on central and decentralized servers available in an app store, shown here, to both the clients and the institutions. This does not mean that the platform will develop all tools itself. The platform will create concepts and standards so that the developed software tools work together seamlessly. Ontologies will naturally play an important role in the realization of the platform. The platform will provide a core ontology, here shown on the bottom of the green box. And this core ontology will clarify essential terminologies and the dependency of data. And the ontology is also linked to material science and engineering knowledge. The domain ontologies of the satellite projects reside on the local servers together with the data. And the platform follows a bottom-up approach. The domain ontologies are the focus. This slide shows the mesh, the central platform server, and the satellite servers here are connected via a WireGuard tunnel. This approach is based on the fact that we want to create a solution for the industry, and they want to retain control over their data, and safety issues and security issues are very important for them. This figure shows the PMD architecture. The structure of the satellite servers will look the same everywhere. A Docker system will be used. And the software solutions run in it and shielded from the operating system. And the containers provide security and data sovereignty also for the PMD operating system. The different Dockers will be prepared for the users. We have, for example, a PMD core, we have a key cloak, and we have apps, different apps. For example, apps for with software solutions to control the ontologies, and also further software like for workflows like SimStack and Pyron. And as I said, security is via WireGuard and also international data space, which is a Fraunhofer ISAC solution. So this is a schematic view of the workflows here from a simulation point of view. We have here users which use different codes, and the users have models and projects, and these provide input for the codes, and simulations are carried out, and the code will produce output, and so on. And all these little steps here shall be automated. And this requires, of course, the material ontology that describes and connects the processes. And the heart will be the material digital server, which ensures the linking and the flow of the workflows. And this slide is very similar, but now shows the experimental viewpoint. Instead of codes, we have here equipment and devices which need input to conduct measurements and output and so on. And also these steps shall be automated. Before finishing, I'll come back to the funding line, Material Digital. We had the call for the second funding phase had generated a very large response. More than 100 project outlines had been submitted. A little bit more than 10 were selected for submission of detailed proposals, and the first of them just started with their work in the last week, or in the last weeks. The material topics addressed in these satellite projects are very wide and range from metallic materials via ceramic, glass, composite materials, elastomers, concrete, and functional materials. And if you are interested to learn more about the new satellite projects, please visit our website.
So, so my name is Yann, as Martin said, and I'm the CEO of a company involved in several European projects around EOSC, including UDAT, EOSC Hub, Ferris Fair, and also EOSC Pillar. I'm going to discuss today some of the work we're doing in these projects, at least two of them, EOSC Pillar and Ferris Fair, around the idea of building federated fair data space. The whole idea of federated fair data space comes from the EOSC Pillar project, which is a cross-disciplinary use case-driven project. It's one of the project called national project, like Expanse that Brian mentioned earlier. But this one is transversal in the sense that it deals with many different scientific communities, because we have 9 different use cases with 8 different scientific communities. And within that project, the different use cases in the project requires actually to ask transversal question and wants to aggregate data coming up from different domains. So the overall idea for helping them is to create spaces where, for instance, here you could aggregate data from biomedical domain, material science, agriculture, and biodiversity data. And in order to achieve this, we are strongly relying on the FAIR principles to actually help the findability, the accessibility, the interoperability, and the reusability of this data. And we have many different cases like this that wants to build such a spaces in the project, and that rely on that cross-disciplinary data integration. So we had to face the question, how can we build a service architecture that would support such aggregation, and in the process help the different communities to verify or to make more fair the data hosted in their repository, and how to aggregate distributed and heterogeneous data resources that have not necessarily common ways of sharing data. So quickly, what is FAIR? Brian already mentioned, so I'm going to quickly skip that. Basically, it's a set of principles for scientific data management and stewardship that's been endorsed by many organizations. And if you want to have more details, I invite you to actually read the paper or even go to the GoFair website. But basically, these are guidelines that helps having systems and designed in order to have machine actionable information. So machines should be able to automatically go and harvest and fetch information for us, basically. And they are based on 2 things: technical considerations. FAIR is based on the idea that each data and metadata should have globally unique, persistent, and resolvable identifiers around metadata, which include subtopics such as provenance, common format, FAIR vocabularies and ontologies, the idea of leveraging domain-specific metadata standards, and the fact that metadata should be persistent despite the disappearance of data, but also about access protocols to be used and authentication and licenses. I will not go into the details. But within the project, we started looking at these principles, but we also started to look at a practical solution to solve the problems of our use cases. And then we started looking at existing tooling for verifying data or supporting more fair data. And we started looking at initiatives and services like the Fair Data Point that has been developed in the context of GoFair, and it's also developed now in the context of the Fair is Fair project. But there are other tools developed in different contexts, like the Verifier, Semaphora, or Fuji, that are used for enriching data and metadata with semantics, for instance. And there are several tools now coming for evaluating the fairness of data, such as Fuji, FairShake, and the Fair Sharing tool. So the overall idea of the EOSC project was not to develop again services that will support verification, but rather to build an architecture that will integrate and leverage the service that already exists for helping verifying the data. And so we came up with this architecture diagram for this federated fair data space, where basically you see at the bottom, there is the data repository layer, where you will see different types of repositories. Oops, sorry. For instance, Dataverse or the Biomedical Data Hub or any other repository. And the idea is that these repositories have all different APIs. So the first step for creating this architecture is to start creating common connectors and generate or create what we call an API federation. And that API federation will be then used by other services such as the Metadata Smart Harvester, that will fetch the metadata from these different repositories and then feed them into two other services, a metadata converter that will allow to federate or make the metadata adhering to one common format, which is in that case DCAT, and a semantic enricher for adding up the semantics that would be missing from the representation. And the idea is to publish on the existing service the Fair Data Point, which is a DCAT store, basically. So it's a metadata, it's a service storing metadata and with the DCAT format. Within the project, we are looking at the two aspects now of this architecture. One side is for the repository owner. And the idea is that you could create on the fly such a federated fair data space, depending on your needs. So we are building now a repository registration interface where repository owners can go, start filling in some information, create the connectors for the API federation, and then start doing the mappings and the enrichment. And in the meantime, the idea is to provide them with information about their content by connecting with fair evaluation tools. There is another task in the same work package that deals with the data consumers. The idea is to aggregate all this wealth of information, but then to make it useful for researchers to answer these transversal questions they are interested in. So we are providing different ways of interlinking. For instance, we're starting to build a federated data space search interface, but we are also investigating connections with virtual research environments, workflow services like Galaxy, or even other community-specific services, and of course, regular big data services. The overall idea is that it needs to be simple to be deployed, it needs to be scalable. So what we're offering in the end with this architecture is a bundle of open source services, easily deployed on any cloud system using Kubernetes. That will allow researchers to create federated fair data space on the fly for various purposes, and to register a repository. We're offering a functionality to allow repositories to register in several federated fair data space without re-entering the information. So all the initial information provided by the repository's owner is going to be reusable. The benefit for that is that you can create in no time data spaces across internal resources, institutions, and domains. And one of the key goals that we had in mind is to reduce the impact on the repository owner, which often have limited resources for updating their technology. So here we are proposing a solution that avoids to have to make too many changes or even no changes at all. And we want to support them in making their repository content more fair in an automated way. The system offers multiple APIs for accessing the content, and it connects easily with processing services. So I will focus now just on the registration workflow for repository owner to create this federated fair data space, and we try to keep it as simple as possible. So the first steps for a data repository owner would be then to register the data repository by providing some metadata about the repository. And we are working on making this metadata compliant, for instance, with the service description template that is being built for the EOSC portal. But also we could consider things like RE3 data, metadata schemas for describing the repository. Once the repository is registered, then there is a step to register the API and to actually align the API of the repository with a common description. And for this, we're using a variant of the Open API framework. It's called Smart API, that allows to have enriched API descriptions and machine actionable API descriptions. Once the API is registered, then the system can go and fetch metadata. And then we are building now the mapping interface that allows the repository owner to map their metadata with the GCAT2 model. Once this mapping is done and then saved and stored, there is the process of enriching metadata with ontologies. And once this is finished, then the system automatically use the mapping and the enrichment for automatically publishing the metadata into the fair data point. In this workflow, we can then connect to other service, the evaluators, the fairness evaluator service for checking the fairness of the content before integration into the federated fair data space, and that can be then tested once it's published to make sure that the data is more compliant toward fair principles. And of course, once it's published on the fair data point, then it can be searched and reused easily. Now, one of the key issues we're facing in the development, of course, is the mapping of metadata. But the main issue is the enrichment with metadata, of the metadata with semantic artifacts. And this is an issue because each domain is developing its own ontologies in its own corner with its own guidelines and way of doing things, which then prevents us to easily access this information or even sometimes find the proper ontology for a domain and therefore to reuse it in our system. So we identified that there is a key need for a harmonized semantic space where we could access the content of all the ontologies that are, of course, publicly available so that we can leverage them for metadata and data enrichment. And that relates to some work that I'm doing and leading in fair semantics, is trying to address the question, how can we make semantic artifacts fair to actually leverage the wealth of existing semantic artifacts to improve the fairness of the data? And this is the work that we are doing in Fair is Fairs. It's 2 years now. It's called the Fair Semantics Recommendation. We have been working extensively with the community of experts from various domains to actually start asking them how we can make their ontology, their control vocabulary, their thesaurus more fair. And this is I would say, a bottom-up approach or community-based approach that was quite successful, actually. We collected in the first brainstorming session we organized in the context of the RDA, so the Research Data Alliance, during their plenary, and we collected more than 75 recommendations or suggestions from the 50 experts that were present. Then we did a lot of analysis, and then we started aggregating them, and now we have a total of 17 general recommendations and 10 best practices. One of the work we have been doing with these recommendations for helping improving the fairness of semantic artifacts is to make sure that we look in the different communities whether or not there are also existing recommendations. And I'm citing here 2 examples, but we've been looking into many others. Here you see the OBO Foundry for biomedical domain. There's also the Industry Ontology Foundry that's been considered, and we are still trying to gather as many of these initiatives as possible to actually promote them and add them to this document. Now, this document, the first version was delivered March 2020, and then we delivered a second iteration of these recommendations after an extensive workshop with more than 40 experts coming from at least 15 different communities to evaluate actually the quality of these recommendations. That led to actually some improvements, and especially we started discussing with them the alignment with the RFC recommendation that determines what is mandatory in terms of recommendation and what is optional. And you can find here the DOI to access the second iteration. So if you're interested, please go ahead and look into it. Now, this work is not finished. We still have 1 year to go and a third iteration of this recommendation. And now we're starting to look into more practical details for the implementation of these recommendations, and also starting discussions about how we could use this recommendation for assessing the fairness of semantic artifacts. And of course, collect input from other communities, and in particular industry experts as well. And this is in the context of the collaboration with the OntoCommons project. Now, these recommendations are open, so I will not go detail this slide, but if you want to contribute, please do so. We are really eager to look at getting more feedback. And the overall idea is that if semantic artifact developers start adhering to a common set of principles, then it would be much, much easier to actually start building a federated fair semantic space that could aggregate contents from ontology repositories. And in that case, that will ease the problem we're facing with the semantic enrichment of data and metadata. And that's it for my part. So thank you for your attention. There's my email here. So if you have any questions after the meeting, you can always contact me.